So I've been on a journey in selecting a 60cc professional chainsaw, and this will be the third video of the series. So my first video, I started off comparing my top 4 picks, and I was able to narrow down my selection to these two chainsaws here, the Makita EA6100 and the Stihl MS 362. And in the following video, I did an unboxing of these two chainsaws. So in this video, I'm going to do a detailed benchtop comparison of the two saws. I want to make sure that this Stihl eBay purchase is functional, and then I'm going to decide which of these two chainsaws I'm going to keep and which one I'm going to sell on. Now, I'm not going to do a performance comparison at this point at least, and that's because these two chainsaws are really well matched in terms of performance, and I don't really think that you're going to see much of a difference in terms of cut time. Plus, it'll be a lot easier to sell a unused chainsaw than it will be a used saw. Okay, well, I had to clean up the Stihl saw a bit after it was in storage for so long. It was looking kind of rough, but now it looks like a brand new chainsaw. So now that they're on the bench and out of the box, I thought I'd go ahead and just kind of give my first impressions of the saws. So this is not my first Stihl chainsaw that I've owned. This MS 362 looks pretty similar to the other Stihl chainsaws I have, and it's a pretty straightforward design. I think it looks nice. This is my first Makita chainsaw, and I have to say they've done pretty well on the aesthetics. Not that aesthetics is something that I look for in a chainsaw, but it looks like a nice saw overall is what I'm saying. I kind of like the way the top cover here is nice and curved. There aren't a lot of sharp edges on this saw, and I kind of like the way the Makita name is stamped here on the side. Just overall looks like a quality chainsaw. It doesn't look like a low entry-level saw by any means. Another thing I was noticing is that the Makita actually looks more narrow if you look at it from the top than the Stihl does, but actually it kind of bulges out at the bottom. So the bottom is quite a bit wider on the Makita than it is on the Stihl. So it's actually a wider saw, and I think that's because of the starter spring in the side here that the Stihl doesn't have. It makes this side bulge out quite a bit more. Also has a little bit of weight. Now, looking at the top, I like the sight line of the Stihl chainsaw. You have a black line on an orange cover, and it's nicely contrasted. Whereas on the Makita, you have this kind of flat black cover. There is a sight line, but it's just a little groove. It's hardly noticeable, in my opinion. Again, not a big deal, but just a difference that I've noticed. Now, another thing I noticed, I was operating these chain brakes, and the Stihl is, pretty straightforward. It just has a really nice, solid engagement and disengagement. Now on the Makita, it's going to work fine, I'm sure. But I was noticing the chain brake here is at a steeper angle, more angled than the Stihl chain brake. And you can see here when you disengage the brake and push it forward that it continues to move a bit. So there's a little bit more play, and it just kind of gives a loosey-goosey feel to it, whereas the Stihl is just really nice and more sturdy. Now, again, not a big deal, but just something I noticed. Now, it's hard not to notice, pulling this out of the box, that these bucking spikes are really large on the Makita. If you compare it to the bucking spikes on the Stihl, these are more sort of average-sized spikes. I have the same or similar bucking spikes on my 261 and 271 saws. These are enormous, relatively speaking. Now, I don't think I'd ever need bucking spikes that big, but I know a lot of guys do like them. So that's another difference. Also notice that the Stihl has holes here on the side cover if you want to install a second set of bucking spikes, whereas the Makita doesn't have that. Again, not an issue for me because one set is fine for me, but it is a difference that I noticed. So yeah, that's basically my first impression. I think these are both nice chainsaws, nice looking chainsaws. The fit and finish on the Stihl to me looks a little bit better, but definitely the Makita is no slouch. Okay, so let's get into some of the details. I'm going to go ahead and start with taking off the top covers. So we'll start with the Stihl because I already have some familiarity with this setup. It looks exactly like my MS 261. There are 3 screws, they're quarter turn screws. You do need a scrunch or a screwdriver to unscrew them. But that was really quick and easy. Here's what the Stihl looks like underneath the top cover. So let me transition over to the Makita, which again is a little bit heavier. Now, this is similar to what Husqvarna uses. They don't have screws, they just have these clips. And this one is too tight, at least as it is brand new, for me to take off these clips without a screwdriver. So again, we'll just use the scrunch tool. Oh yeah, that's super easy. I have to say, getting off this top cover was easier than the Stihl, not by a lot, but I do like that system. Okay, so wow, this is very straightforward and simple. I do like this setup. I mean, you can see everything. The Stihls are notorious for building in complexity. Not to say that they're bad saws, but you can see that everything's just really simple and very easy to get to. So let's take a look at the air filters. So again, I'm already familiar with this air filter. It's the same filter I have on my 261 and similar to the 271 Farm and Ranch saw. I really do like the way that the filter installs. It's a good quality filter. I like the pleated style filters. They're also washable. But to get these off and on, you just basically unscrew it. And to get it on, you just screw it back on. And you hear it click. Now the only downside, I think, in my opinion, of this style of attachment is if you don't hear it click or feel it and you keep screwing it on, you will break it. So it's a little bit fragile. You just have to be careful. There's a little clip inside of the air filter which attaches to this little shroud here. And yeah, if you keep on turning it, it'll just break the plastic. So anyway, like I said, I have two chainsaws that have this exact setup, and I've never had any problem with getting any kind of dust or smaller particulates underneath this air filter and into the carburetor. So this system works well, super easy to attach and unattach, and it's got a nice little rubber, or maybe it's a silicone seal that works well. So that is the Stihl. This is the first time I've had the cover off of this Makita. But this is very straightforward. It looks like they're just using this little thumb screw. Again, nice pleated style air filter. This looks like it's going to move more air volume than the Stihl, but again, very high quality. And I like this. This is pretty simple and straightforward. It even has a little slot on the top of this thumb screw to put a screwdriver if you over torque it or that. Oh wow, this seal is really nice. It's thicker than the Stihl. And yeah, I think this is going to work really nicely. Yeah, that's going to give a nice good seal. No problems with that at all. So yeah, that was not quite as easy to get off as the Stihl, but again, it was definitely not hard. Good quality filter. Here's the shroud. And again, you know, everything, if you want to take that spark plug off or out, it's super easy. Getting to the carb is just right there. Looks like you have a couple of screws for this shroud, maybe 4 nuts rather. Yeah, very straightforward and simple. So that's what the two saws look like underneath the top covers. And I won't say that one is better than the other. I think the Makita was a little easier to get into, getting that top cover off. But the Stihl is a little easier getting the air filter off. But basically, I would say they're roughly equivalent in terms of easy access to things, or at least the air filter. Again, the Makita, a little bit more straightforward design. Okay, let's get these top covers back on. Yeah, that's a nice design. I like that. I was able to snap those back on without any tools. Yeah, this works really nicely. Now the Stihl always requires me to fiddle a little bit. Yeah, there we go. You have to get it over the control switch here. Not that it's difficult, but since I'm comparing, this Makita was super easy to get into and get the cover back on. So there you have it. So that's the top cover. I think they both have pretty nice designs. So let's go to the next thing. I'm going to go ahead and start looking at the side covers. I'll start with the Makita. Use the scrunch tool. These nuts are already loose. I've never taken this off before. So, okay, so those are not captive nuts. And this side cover is plastic. So that's a downside, I guess, of the Makita. The Stihl uses a metal side cover, which is going to last a lot longer. The plastic's going to get scratched up and potentially cracked over time and may even discolor. So the Stihl side cover is going to be more durable. But, you know, that's not something that would cause me not to buy this chainsaw. Okay, so the side cover's off. This has a really big protective plate here. See what it looks like under the Stihl side cover. Stihl's using these bigger nuts. Yeah, these are really loose as well. So the Stihl, again, magnesium cover, and assuming this is the same setup I have on the 261, which it looks like it is, these nuts are captive. It's not a huge difference, but I tell you, it's a lot nicer having these captive nuts, especially when you're working on the chainsaw outside. If you need to take off the side cover for any reason, these nuts don't get lost. Whereas these, they do, and I do knock these off my bench fairly often, but that's not a big deal. I can pick them back off the floor, but when you knock this off outside and it gets fallen in the forest somewhere, it may stay there forever. So these captive nuts, these are really the way to go. Okay, so it's interesting. All this is magnesium here, but the Makita has this really extra large protective plate that the Stihl doesn't have. The Stihl uses some extra protection underneath the bar. This piece here feels really thin though. And again, this is just like my MS261, same design basically. I don't know that's a huge difference. I mean, the case here is magnesium anyway, so I don't know that you really require that extra protection. But I kind of like the way that that plate looks. It looks like it's really durable. Probably adds a little bit of weight as well. Again, the Stihl is a little more weight conscious than just about everybody else. And while this isn't a heavy saw in comparison, it's a little bit heavier. Now they're both using inboard clutch brakes, which I really prefer. I don't like the Husqvarna and other chainsaws as well that have the external clutch system. It's just, it fills up with chips easier. You have to clean it out. And this system is way easier to get the chain on and off. As you can probably tell, there's nothing to impede the chain. You just wrap it right over and it's super easy. So I like that about both chainsaws. I do definitely like the internal clutch. Not much else to point out. The chain catcher here is very similar. It looks almost identical, slightly different shape, just a piece of aluminum there. So one thing I noticed that's different is the handles. So Stihl always uses plastic handles, or at least all the chainsaws I have plastic handles, so all the newer ones, which, you know, it's definitely light, but it's not going to be as durable as a metal one. This one looks like it's aluminum on the Makita. Yeah, I think that's aluminum. So this is going to be a more durable handle. So, you know, different manufacturers are using different materials to reduce weight or to add strength. So you have the plastic side cover over here, metal side cover here, but this is using a metal handle, whereas this one's using a plastic handle. So I just noticed something else just while I was moving the chainsaws around here. And I already mentioned that the Stihl has a plastic handle versus an aluminum handle on the Makita. But something I just noticed is that the Makita handle has a really nice rubberized coating, and it makes it really nice to grab and move around. The Stihl, on the other hand, is plastic. There's really no grip there. It's rather slippery. So I would give 1 point there to the Makita. I really like the nice grippy handle. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about something which may be a point of contention with some folks, and that is the fuel tank and the oil tank caps. Now, the reason this is somewhat controversial is that Stihl's using a very different system than pretty much everybody else. Pretty much everybody else just uses standard caps, which have a threaded connection, and you just screw them on and screw them off. It's very straightforward and simple, whereas Stihl is using what I would call a cam system, I guess. So instead of having a threaded connection, you basically just have a quarter of a turn to release, and then a quarter of a turn to get the cap back on. And you have this little flip up tab here, which provides a little handle for your hand. Now, I find that I can get these on and off easily with gloves, and you never have to use any tools. So that's one reason why I like these. Now, when I first bought my very first Stihl chainsaw, it had this style of caps, and I actually didn't like them when I first got that saw. And the reason is the first time I went to fill up my oil tank, I didn't have the cap on properly. I thought it was locked in, and it wasn't. And when I picked up the saw, the oil started pouring out, and I was thinking, wow, that's a really bad design. They should make it easier to get on and off. But after I've worked with it for a little while, I became a little more accustomed to how it locks into place, and making sure that you're actually on the little lock notch whenever it's in place. And now I can say I really actually like this system better. The reason is that it never requires additional torque to get these off, even when you may have pressure built up in the tank, or maybe a temperature difference which would cause a threaded system to kind of lock tighter. These are always super easy. You just pull this up. Again, no tools ever required, and you just do a quarter turn and it pops right out. Whereas on the threaded system, it's quite common for these to get difficult to get off if you over torque it, or again, you get pressure built up in the tank or something like that. These can be a real chore to get off. So my personal preference is these Stihl ones, but certainly a lot of people don't like those, and I can kind of understand why. I would just say, if you do have a Stihl, just work with it a little bit, get familiar with it. It's really not that difficult, and once you get used to it, you may end up liking it better. Now, I will say that one thing that Makita has done to prevent that over torque situation, or the situation where it becomes really hard to get these off, is they've put this little groove in here where you can get some extra leverage with the scrunch tool. So that makes it really easy to take off, provided you have a tool with you. So another thing that I was noticing on this one here, on the Makita, this is a very standard design. You'll see lots of saws use this little plastic thing here. I've had these break before pretty easily, actually. Now, I don't know, Makita may use a better quality plastic, although this looks kind of flimsy to me. But I have had these break. It's not very expensive to replace. On the Stihl, I think this is a nicer system, personally. Instead of having that cheap plastic, they're using what looks like to be a nylon thread. It must be some fuel-resistant material, polyester maybe, or nylon. This is just a really cool design. So if you notice, there's a little notch up here, and you can put this little thread into that notch, and so this whole thing is out of the way. Also, the attachment point is on the side, so that you don't have, like on this one, you don't have that plastic right in the middle. Now again, you can take these out. Usually I leave them in when I'm filling up the tank, and it always gets in the way a little bit. The reason I leave them in place is because I found that sometimes taking these in and out a lot will have a tendency to weaken the plastic and break them. And so if you leave it in, it's somewhat in the way. Whereas this one, it's always on the side. You just put it in the notch, and now you have that whole opening available for fuel. So I have a personal preference for these. I have chainsaws from different manufacturers, and to me the Stihls are always just a little bit easier to work on, because they design a lot of little features like this, which just make things a little bit easier, makes life a little bit easier. Again, this would not be something that I would choose to buy a saw or not buy a saw, but it makes life a little bit easier. So I prefer this system myself. Okay, so let's talk about the starting systems. So the Makita here is using a spring-assisted starter. Now, I have a similar setup on my Stihl MS211, and it does make the chainsaw easier to start. I actually really like that system. The downside is that it makes the saw wider. As you can tell, if you compare with the Stihl, that extra spring adds several inches of width, where the Stihl doesn't have that, and it's also heavier. Now, Stihl, on the other hand, they're using a decompression valve to make the saw a little bit easier to start. So when you press that in, your engine has less compression during startup. It makes it a lot easier to turn over. The decompression valve is going to be a lot lighter and a lot easier to replace, in my opinion, than the spring-assisted starter. Now, Stihl's also using a little spring here in the starter handle, just to kind of dampen out that the feel of compression. I don't know which is better. I'm going to pull on them a little bit and see if I can feel a difference. I can definitely feel a lot of compression here, even with that starter spring in place, and there's no decompression valve. So let me compare that to the Stihl. So it's nice that the piston is moving freely after sitting in a box for 7 years. So there's a lot of compression there. I'm going to go ahead and press in the decompression valve, and that is significantly easier. So let me compare again to this guy. Yeah, you can see this is requiring quite a bit of force to pull. I think that the Stihl, just based on that, it's going to require less pulling force. That's what I think. Okay, so another difference in the starting systems is that the Makita here has a priming bulb, as you can see there, whereas the Stihl doesn't have a priming bulb. Now, the upside of having a priming bulb is you can get the fuel moving before you start cranking over the engine. You can get the fuel up to the carb, and that should, at least theoretically, require fewer pulls on the starter rope in order to get the engine going. Now, the downside of having a primer bulb is that you're introducing a potential failure point and also another maintenance item as well. Now, I have chainsaws with both systems, and I actually like my saws without the priming bulb a little better because I've never really noticed a big difference in the number of times I need to pull over the rope. I usually give a couple of partial pulls before I go to start the saw anyway, and so my personal preference is not to have the priming bulb because that's just one more thing that I don't have to worry about. Okay, so let's take a look at the operator controls, and we'll start with the Stihl here. So this is the M-tronic version of this saw, so the controls are going to be slightly different from the standard version, but they'll be similar. So like all the newer Stihl saws, in order to get this into choke, I need to move the lever all the way down. In order to move the lever down, I have to squeeze the throttle in first, then I can push the lever down into choke. And to keep it into choke, now I need to release the throttle. So now it stays in the choke position there. And with the M-tronic version, there's no half choke position. It's either choke, run, or off. And to get it from choke to run, I just squeeze in the throttle. That pops it up into run. And then to stop the engine, I just push the lever all the way up. And there's a little stop sign in case you forget. Now, if you notice, when I release the lever, it goes back to run. So now it's ready to start back up again. So let's take a look at the Makita. So the Makita is basically the opposite in that the choke is all the way up. And I didn't have to pull in the throttle in order to get there. So that's choke. And then when I push this down one notch, it actually puts the saw into a half choke mode or a half throttle mode. So to get that half throttle off, all I need to do is squeeze in the trigger. You'll hear it click off, and now it's in run. So there's not a separate position for the half throttle or half choke. It's either choke, run, or stop, just like with the Stihl. But if you're coming from choke, it automatically puts the half throttle on when it goes down to the run position. So to stop the engine, you would push the lever all the way down. So that would stop it, and just like with the Stihl, when you release, it comes back up into the run position, and it's ready to start again. Now, looking at the levers themselves, in my opinion, when I first saw the Stihl mechanism, it looked and felt a little flimsy to me. They're kind of using a thin plastic, but I've never broken one of these, and they did do a nice job in putting it into this little recess, so it's not going to catch any branches or anything. On the Makita, this is a thicker plastic. This feels nice and sturdy. On the other hand, it does stick out. I guess you could get a branch in there and break it, but it is a nice and sturdy plastic. I think both work pretty well. Now, I have heard people complain about the Stihl because it's basically backwards, where stop is all the way up, whereas most chainsaws stop is all the way down. But in my opinion, that's not a real valid argument, because this is a really simple setup and it's pretty easy to learn. It doesn't take much time or effort to learn either of these systems. So I think either of these works just fine. They're both pretty simple and straightforward in my opinion. Okay, so let's talk about carburetors. So this is the Stihl MS 362 CM version. The CM means it comes with the M-tronic computer-controlled carburetor. Now, Stihl does offer this saw without the M-tronic carburetor that just has a standard manually adjustable carb. But I've noticed that that saw is a lot less common. Now, if you're buying a brand new one, you can probably have your dealer order a standard version if you prefer that version, but they're pretty rare on the secondhand market. So the Makita only comes in one variant, and that is just with a standard carburetor. They do not offer the electronically controlled carb, so this is just a manually adjusting carb. Now, the primary advantage of the M-tronic system is that it adjusts the carburetor automatically for temperature, elevation, and airflow. And I can definitely see where if you're a professional user, say a logger, for example, who may be cutting down at sea level one day and up in the cold mountains the next day, a system like that is going to be really beneficial. But for me, I'm just a homeowner. I'm generally using the chainsaw at the same location every day, and as long as I keep my air filter and carburetor clean, I don't really see the need for carburetor adjustments all that often. So in my opinion, the downsides of the M-tronic system are an added complexity and parts cost. Now, based on my experience with the Stihl MS 261, the M-tronic version of that chainsaw comes with an ignition coil that has an embedded microcontroller. And that ignition coil costs about $100 more on the M-tronic version than on the standard version. So if you're planning to keep the chainsaw for long enough to have that ignition coil fail, it's going to cost you about $100 more to replace the ignition coil. So I just prefer the simplicity of the standard carburetor version for that reason. And if I were going to order a new chainsaw from the dealer, that's the one I would choose. Okay, so both saws offer a provision for operating the chainsaw in a standard environment or a cold environment. Now, Stihl defines cold as anything less than 10 Celsius, and Makita defines it as less than 5 Celsius. So basically temperatures around the freezing point. So if you notice here, there's a little orange tab, and there's a picture of a sun and a picture of a snowflake, and there's a little notch on top of the tab. That notch is currently aligned to the sun, so this is normal operation. Now, if you want to put the saw in cold operation, you just pull up on this tab, flip it upside down, and now the notch is aligned to the snowflake up here, and there's a hole here. Now, that hole just allows warm air from the engine to come into here and heat up the carburetor. So that's cold operation, and to get it switched back, you just flip this guy back over. Very simple and straightforward. Now, Makita offers a very similar solution, except they put their little tab on the underside of the top cover. Here it is here, this little gray guy here, and it's currently in the standard operation. That's a picture of a sun, and you would pull it out and flip it over to get it into cold operation. And now there's a little hole there, you can see there, and that allows, again, warm air from the engine to heat up the carburetor. So pretty simple design. They're both very similar. Okay, so let's talk about price. So the Makita definitely comes in at a lower price point. And while I'm making this video, the online price for this Makita is around $300 less than what you pay for a brand new Stihl in a Stihl dealer. Now, I got a great deal on both of these chainsaws. I didn't pay retail for either of them, but once I factor in the cost of having a longer bar and chain, I will have had about $90 more into the Stihl 362 than the Makita. So I need to make a decision as to whether or not the Stihl is worth that extra $90. Okay, so let's talk about support. So I talked about this in my last video, but real briefly, Stihl definitely has an advantage there. They have a huge dealer network, and Makita, based on what I read at least, is exiting out of the gas chainsaw business. So if support is a big consideration for you, the Stihl definitely has the advantage. Now, I haven't used either of these chainsaws yet, but after comparing the features and looking them over and thinking about the price, here's my initial thought. So if I had to buy a brand new chainsaw from a dealer or from a retailer, I want to choose the Makita 6100 every day of the week. And that's because it offers very similar functionality, but at a fraction of the cost. Now, the cost is less of a consideration for me because I got a really great deal on this 362, so the price difference wasn't huge. So I'm really thinking that I like the Stihl better based on what I've seen so far. Definitely leaning toward the Stihl, but that assumes that the Stihl is actually functional, and that hasn't been determined yet. So what I need to do next, I need to get a bar and chain for this chainsaw. I need to see if it starts up, and I'll run it a bit and cut some wood. And assuming that this chainsaw is functional, I believe I'm going to keep the Stihl MS 362 and sell off the Makita. Now, if it turns out that there's something wrong with the 362 and it's not functional, then I'm going to sell this at a loss, I guess, and I'll keep the Makita. So that's the plan. Let me go ahead and get this guy checked out and see if it runs.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Well, that was pretty interesting. You know, it was getting dark out there. Sorry for that, but I wanted to get it started up before it got totally dark. And, you know, it took a few more pulls than I was expecting, and it was running a bit rough there right at the very beginning. Of course, it is about 42 degrees outside, so it's pretty cold. And once it warmed up, after just a few seconds, it started to run really nicely. It was really, really smooth. I was pretty impressed by the throttle response here at low throttle. It's just very linear and very smooth. I would say it's definitely smoother than my MS261, and you can definitely feel the power. Again, once it warmed up, man, it takes no time to get this engine up to top RPM. Of course, there's no bar and chain on it, and that probably helps as well. And that gets me to the next point, which is I need to get a bar and chain for this guy. Obviously, it'll run, so we need to find out if it'll cut and make sure that the bar oiler works and so on. So anyway, yeah, that was pretty fun. Okay, so I've ordered a 25-inch bar and some chains for the Stihl MS 362 here. Now, this is a Oregon professional bar, so it's a solid bar, which means it should be really durable and good for slabbing work. Now, the crosscut chains from Oregon were on back order, but they did send me a couple of these rip cutting chains, and that's what I have on here now. Now, of course, you can cut cross cuts with a rip cutting chain, but it's going to cut a bit slower because of the angle of the cutters. So anyway, the idea is I'm going to go ahead and take this outside and start her up and make sure the oiling system works and basically make sure it cuts wood without any problems. So let's check it out. Okay, well, as you saw, the Stihl MS 362 starting very easily. It's running really smoothly. It's producing good power. The bar oiler is working perfectly well. And I was able to rip cut some really hard, dried out Douglas fir without any problems at all. So it does appear as though I purchased a brand new chainsaw that had just been sitting on a shelf for quite some time. And I have been burned before in the past on eBay purchases, but it seems like this one worked out pretty well for me, and I'm pretty happy about that. I really do like the Makita EA6100. I think overall it's a better value in terms of price per performance versus the Stihl MS 362. But the 362, it just has more attributes which I like personally, which just make my life a little bit easier. I like the lighter weight. The decompression valve is great. It makes it easier to start. I like the fuel and the oil cap designs a little bit better. And the fact that Stihl offers a 25-inch bar with this chainsaw, well, that's just the perfect bar length for me. Now, I also think that I have a higher likelihood of being able to get parts and service into the future choosing the Stihl over the Makita. But one of the biggest factors is the fact that I already own a Stihl MS 261 chainsaw, which is of a similar design as the 362. In fact, I just recently ordered a 0.325-inch rim sprocket that will fit on this chainsaw, which will very quickly and easily allow me to run the MS261 bars and chains on this saw here. And I also already have a bunch of spare parts which will fit on this chainsaw as well. So all the money that I'll be able to save on spare bars and chains and spare parts more than compensates for the fact that the 362 here cost me a little bit more than the Makita saw did. So I wouldn't hesitate to recommend the Makita 6100. The Stihl MS 362 just makes more sense based on the price that I paid for it. So I guess this concludes the 60cc chainsaw selection series. I've decided to keep the Stihl saw, and I'm going to sell off the Makita saw here. And if you subscribe to the channel, you'll probably see me operating this MS 362 in the future. So hopefully this video series was interesting or informative, and we'll see you next time.